One fire can erase a city, another can erase a town. Some move slowly, others outrun entire communities. Across American history, fires have exposed the same weakness again and again. When conditions align, everything changes in minutes. These events are not distant history. They are warnings. This series breaks down the fires that reshaped America and the lessons we cannot afford to ignore. Great Chicago Fire, 1871. By the fall of 1871, Chicago was one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. Much of that growth was built quickly and cheaply. Homes, businesses, sidewalks, and even sections of the city's infrastructure were constructed primarily from wood. After months of drought, the city was exceptionally dry and vulnerable. On the evening of October 8th, a fire broke out on the city's southwest side. While the exact cause remains uncertain, the conditions were already primed for disaster. Strong winds drove the flames rapidly through nearby neighborhoods. Compounding the problem, Chicago's fire department was already exhausted after battling another major fire the night before, leaving crews understaffed and equipment stretched thin. As the fire advanced, it jumped the Chicago River, something many believed impossible. Once across, it tore through the city's commercial center and densely packed residential districts. Communication failures and limited water pressure made coordinated response nearly impossible. For more than 2 days, the fire burned unchecked. When it finally ended, over 3 square miles of the city lay in ruins. An estimated 300 people were killed, and roughly 100,000 residents were left homeless. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. Economic losses reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet the Great Chicago Fire became a turning point. The city rebuilt with new fire codes, stricter regulations, and a shift toward brick, stone, and steel construction. Chicago emerged as a leader in modern urban planning and fire-resistant design. The lesson was unmistakable. Rapid growth without resilience carries a cost. And when fire finds weakness, it exploits it completely. Great Fire of Boston, 1872. By the early 1870s, Boston was a dense and heavily industrialized city. Its commercial district was packed with brick warehouses and narrow streets, many of them filled with flammable goods such as textiles, paper, and alcohol. While the buildings appeared sturdy from the outside, fire protection systems had not kept pace with the city's growth. On the evening of November 9, 1872, a fire broke out in a downtown warehouse. Strong winds quickly pushed the flames through adjoining buildings. Fire crews responded rapidly, but they faced immediate challenges. Water pressure was inconsistent, hydrants were poorly distributed, and many hoses were incompatible with equipment brought in from neighboring cities. As the fire spread, confusion compounded the problem. Mutual aid companies arrived from across New England, only to discover their hose couplings would not fit Boston's hydrants. Valuable time was lost as crews attempted improvised connections. The fire burned for nearly 20 hours, consuming much of the city's commercial heart. By the time the flames were extinguished, more than 750 buildings had been destroyed. Financial losses were immense, estimated at over $70 million. Although no lives were directly lost to the fire, thousands were left unemployed as businesses collapsed and insurance companies failed under the strain. The Great Fire of Boston exposed a critical lesson. Coordination and standardization matter as much as manpower. In response, national standards for fire hose couplings were adopted, allowing departments to work together seamlessly. Boston also strengthened building codes and invested in modern fire prevention systems. The fire became a turning point, proving that urban resilience depends not only on strong buildings, but on systems that function together when everything goes wrong. San Francisco Earthquake and Fire, 1906. In the early morning hours of April 18, 1906, San Francisco was shaken awake by one of the most powerful earthquakes in U.S. history. Buildings collapsed instantly, streets fractured, and infrastructure failed across the city. But the earthquake itself was only the beginning of the disaster. Gas lines ruptured throughout San Francisco, igniting fires in multiple locations. At the same time, water mains shattered beneath the streets, leaving firefighters without the resources needed to respond. With no reliable water supply, small fires quickly merged into massive firestorms. For 3 days, the fires burned unchecked. Winds pushed flames through neighborhoods faster than evacuation and response efforts could adapt. In some areas, officials attempted to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings with explosives. In many cases, these actions unintentionally spread the fire further by igniting additional blazes. Entire districts were consumed. Homes, businesses, and landmarks disappeared block by block. When the fires finally burned themselves out, more than 80% of the city had been destroyed. An estimated 3,000 people were killed, and over 250,000 residents were left homeless. The destruction of San Francisco forced a national reckoning. Building codes were rewritten to account for seismic risks. Fire-resistant construction became a priority. Emergency management practices evolved to consider cascading failures, where one disaster triggers another. The 1906 earthquake and fire revealed a hard truth. Disasters rarely occur in isolation. When infrastructure fails at multiple points at once, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult. San Francisco's rebuilding would influence urban planning and disaster preparedness for generations to come. Baltimore Fire, 1904. In February of 1904, Baltimore was a major industrial and commercial hub, with its downtown packed tightly with warehouses, offices, and factories. Many of these buildings stored combustible materials and were constructed close together, creating ideal conditions for a large fire to spread. On the morning of February 7th, a fire broke out in a wholesale warehouse in the city's business district. Strong winds quickly pushed the flames from building to building. Baltimore's fire department responded immediately, but the scale of the fire soon overwhelmed local resources. As help arrived from surrounding cities, a critical problem became clear. Fire engines from New York, Philadelphia, and Washington were unable to connect their hoses to Baltimore's hydrants. There was no national standard for hose couplings, and incompatible equipment rendered much of the mutual aid ineffective. Valuable hours were lost as crews attempted makeshift solutions. The fire burned for more than 30 hours, destroying over 1,500 buildings across 140 acres of downtown Baltimore. Miraculously, no lives were officially lost, but the economic damage was devastating. Entire industries were displaced, and the city's commercial center was effectively erased. In the aftermath, Baltimore rebuilt with wider streets, stricter building codes, and modernized fire protection systems. Most importantly, the disaster accelerated the adoption of standardized fire hose couplings nationwide, ensuring that fire departments could work together during large-scale emergencies. The Baltimore fire demonstrated that preparedness is not only about response strength, but about interoperability. When systems cannot connect under pressure, even the best intentions fall short. Great Seattle Fire, 1889. By the late 1880s, Seattle was a booming port city built quickly to support trade, logging, and rail traffic. Much of its downtown business district was constructed almost entirely of wood. Streets were narrow, buildings were tightly packed, and fire prevention measures were minimal. On June 6, 1889, a small fire started in a woodworking shop. What began as a routine incident rapidly escalated. Fueled by wooden structures, sawdust, and stored materials, the fire spread from building to building with alarming speed. Strong winds pushed flames through the heart of the city. Fire crews responded, but water pressure was inconsistent and infrastructure was limited. Within hours, the fire consumed Seattle's entire central business district. 25 city blocks were destroyed as the fire burned itself out along the waterfront. Remarkably, no one was killed. The quick evacuation of the area prevented loss of life. But the economic damage was severe. Businesses, offices, and shipping facilities were reduced to ash, threatening the city's future as a commercial center. Seattle's response reshaped the city permanently. Reconstruction required the use of brick and stone rather than wood. Streets were widened, and the downtown core was raised to address drainage and sanitation issues. Modern fire codes were introduced, and infrastructure was rebuilt with resilience in mind. The Great Seattle Fire demonstrated that disasters do not always result in tragedy if people can escape in time. But it also showed that unchecked growth and flammable construction create inevitable failure points. Great Fire of New York, 1835. In December of 1835, New York City was already the financial heart of the young United States. The area known as Lower Manhattan was packed with warehouses filled with imported goods, much of it highly flammable. The city was growing faster than its infrastructure could safely support. On the night of December 16th, temperatures were well below freezing. A fire broke out in a warehouse near the East River, and within minutes it was clear this was not an ordinary blaze. Strong winds pushed flames westward, while the cold crippled the city's ability to respond. Fire hoses froze solid. Water sources became unusable. Firefighters were forced to watch as the fire spread beyond control. As the flames advanced toward Wall Street, desperate measures were taken. Buildings were deliberately blown up using gunpowder in an attempt to create fire breaks. These explosions slowed the spread, but only after massive destruction had already occurred. By the time the fire burned itself out the following day, more than 670 buildings had been destroyed. The heart of New York's financial district was left in ruins. Stock exchanges, banks, insurance offices, and warehouses were reduced to ash. While remarkably only 2 people were confirmed killed, the economic impact was catastrophic. Losses were estimated at over $20 million, an enormous sum for the time. The Great Fire of 1835 exposed fundamental weaknesses in urban preparedness. In response, New York invested heavily in infrastructure improvements. Most notably, the city accelerated construction of the Croton Aqueduct, providing a reliable and pressurized water supply. Building materials shifted towards stone and brick, and fire codes became more structured. This fire did not just reshape New York's skyline. It reshaped how American cities understood risk, infrastructure, and the cost of being unprepared in extreme conditions. Peshtigo Fire, 1871. In October of 1871, northeastern Wisconsin was heavily forested but deeply altered by logging. Dry branches, sawdust, and slash covered the ground. After weeks of drought, the region had become extremely volatile. Small fires were common and often ignored, viewed as a routine part of clearing land. On the night of October 8, multiple fires merged under strengthening winds and transformed into a firestorm. Survivors later described the fire behaving unlike anything they had ever seen. Eyewitnesses reported massive rotating columns of flame moving across the landscape, what we now recognize as fire tornadoes. These fire-driven vortices uprooted trees, hurled burning debris through the air, and flattened entire sections of forest. The town of Peshtigo was struck with almost no warning. Buildings ignited instantly as superheated air raced through the streets. Many residents fled toward the Peshtigo River. Some survived by fully submerging themselves in the water, holding onto logs or riverbanks as the fire roared overhead. Others were overcome by heat and smoke before they could escape. When the fire finally burned out, between 1,500 and 2,500 people were dead. making it the deadliest wildfire in American history. Entire towns across Wisconsin and Michigan were erased in a single night. The Peshtigo fire occurred on the same night as the Great Chicago Fire and was largely overshadowed in the national press. Yet its lesson remains critical. Under the right conditions, fire can generate its own weather, move at impossible speeds, and destroy everything in its path before human response is even possible. Great Atlanta Fire, 1917. By 1917, Atlanta was a rapidly expanding city, pushing outward faster than infrastructure and planning could keep up. Many residential neighborhoods were built with wooden homes packed closely together. A prolonged dry period had left the city vulnerable, and fire protection resources were stretched thin. On the afternoon of May 21st, a fire ignited in the city's industrial district, near a large factory complex. Strong winds quickly carried sparks into nearby neighborhoods. As the fire spread, witnesses later recalled flames leaping from roof to roof, with embers raining down blocks ahead of the main fire front. Streetcars stopped running as power and lines were damaged. Firefighters struggled to establish water pressure as the blaze moved faster than hose lines could be deployed. Residents fled on foot, carrying what they could, while entire streets ignited almost simultaneously. Over the course of 10 hours, the fire destroyed nearly 2,000 buildings across more than 300 acres. Approximately 70,000 people were left homeless. While only one death was officially recorded, the human impact was severe, with families displaced and entire neighborhoods erased. In the aftermath, Atlanta faced the reality of uncontrolled urban expansion. Rebuilding efforts focused on zoning, wider streets, and improved fire breaks between residential and industrial areas. Building codes were strengthened, and infrastructure modernization accelerated. The Great Atlanta Fire revealed how quickly a city can unravel when growth outpaces preparedness. It was not a failure of response alone, but a failure of planning, made visible in a single night of fire. Hinckley Fire, 1894. In the late 19th century, central Minnesota was dominated by logging operations. Vast forests were cut aggressively, leaving behind piles of dry debris. Controlled burns were commonly used to clear land and dispose of waste. After months of drought, these practices created an extremely dangerous environment. On September 1, 1894, multiple small fires burning throughout the region were pushed together by powerful winds. As the fires merged, they transformed into a fast-moving inferno. Survivors later described the sky turning black in the middle of the afternoon and the air becoming so hot it was difficult to breathe. The town of Hinckley lay directly in the fire's path. Flames advanced so quickly that many residents had no time to flee. Railroad tracks became both an escape route and a trap. Some people attempted to outrun the fire by train, while others were caught when rail lines became blocked or engines stalled. Witnesses recalled burning embers falling like rain, igniting buildings before the main fire even arrived. In just a few hours, Hinckley was destroyed. More than 400 people were killed, with some estimates higher. Thousands more were left homeless. Entire communities across Minnesota were erased or permanently abandoned. The Hinckley Fire forced national attention on the dangers of unchecked industrial land practices. It also highlighted the need for coordinated evacuation planning and better public understanding of wildfire behavior. Like Peshtigo before it, Hinckley demonstrated that wildfires driven by wind and fuel do not behave predictably. They do not give warnings. When conditions align, survival depends on speed, awareness, and planning that exists long before the fire begins. Great Fire of Troy, 1820. In the early 19th century, Troy, New York was emerging as a major industrial center. Mills, factories, and warehouses lined the river, driving economic growth, but also concentrating risk. Buildings were constructed close together, often using a mix of wood framing and early masonry, with little separation between industrial and residential areas. On the night of September 20th, 1820, a fire broke out in the city's industrial district. Strong winds carried sparks from building to building, and the fire spread rapidly through mills and warehouses filled with flammable materials. With limited firefighting equipment and no organized municipal fire department, response options were severely constrained. Eyewitnesses described flames reflecting off the river and lighting the sky for miles. Entire blocks burned simultaneously as embers landed far ahead of the main fire. Efforts to stop the blaze were largely ineffective, and residents were forced to flee as the fire consumed the heart of the city. By the time the fire burned itself out, a significant portion of Troy's commercial and industrial core had been destroyed. While the death toll was relatively low, the economic impact was severe. Factories, mills, and livelihoods were lost in a single night. The rebuilding of Troy marked a shift toward more fire-resistant construction. Brick became the preferred material, industrial facilities were separated from residential areas, and early fire prevention practices were adopted. The Great Fire of Troy illustrated a recurring pattern in American history. As industry expands, risk accumulates. Without deliberate planning and safeguards, growth can quickly turn into vulnerability when fire enters the equation. Oakland Hills Firestorm, 1991. In October of 1991, the hills above Oakland, California, were primed for disaster. Years of drought, dense vegetation, and strong seasonal winds had created extreme wildfire conditions. The area was also heavily developed, with homes built along narrow, winding roads in the wildland-urban interface. On the morning of October 20th, a small grass fire reignited after being contained the day before. Within minutes, shifting winds transformed it into a firestorm. Flames moved uphill with explosive speed, driven by powerful gusts that carried embers far ahead of the main fire front. Residents later described walls of fire moving through neighborhoods without warning. Fire whirls formed as heat and wind interacted, igniting entire blocks almost simultaneously. Firefighters were overwhelmed as hoses failed, visibility collapsed, and escape routes became impassable. In less than 24 hours, over 3,000 homes were destroyed, 25 people were killed, and more than 150 were injured. The economic damage exceeded $1.5 billion, making it one of the most destructive fires in U.S. history at the time. The Oakland Hills firestorm forced a major reevaluation of how cities manage vegetation, building materials, and evacuation planning in high-risk areas. It underscored the danger of wind-driven fires in developed landscapes. Unlike earlier urban fires, this disaster blurred the line between wildfire and city fire. It demonstrated that modern communities built into fire-prone terrain face risks that cannot be addressed by response alone. Prevention, land use planning, and public awareness became central to future wildfire policy. Camp Fire, Paradise, 2018. In November of 2018, Northern California was experiencing extreme drought conditions following years of reduced rainfall and rising temperatures. Vegetation across the region was critically dry. Communities in the foothills, including the town of Paradise, were surrounded by forested terrain with limited evacuation routes. On the morning of November 8, the camp fire ignited in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Fanned by strong winds, the fire spread at a pace that stunned both residents and emergency responders. Within hours, it raced downhill toward Paradise, overtaking roads, power lines, and neighborhoods faster than evacuation alerts could be issued or acted upon. Survivors later described fire appearing on both sides of the road as they attempted to escape. Traffic gridlock trapped vehicles as embers ignited homes and trees around them. Some residents were forced to abandon cars and flee on foot. Others were unable to escape at all. By the time the fire was contained, Paradise was almost completely destroyed. 85 people were killed, making it the deadliest wildfire in California's history. More than 18,000 structures were lost, and tens of thousands were displaced. The Camp Fire exposed critical weaknesses in evacuation planning, emergency communications, and infrastructure resilience. It also intensified scrutiny on power line management and land use decisions in high-risk areas. Paradise became a symbol of how modern wildfires can overwhelm communities in minutes. The lesson was clear and devastating. When fire moves faster than warning systems, preparedness must exist long before the first spark. Lahaina Fire, 2023. In August of 2023, the island of Maui was experiencing unusually dry conditions following months of limited rainfall. At the same time, Hurricane Dora passed far south of Hawaii, generating powerful winds across the islands. These winds, combined with dry vegetation and aging infrastructure, created an extremely dangerous situation. On August 8, multiple fires ignited across Maui. In Lahaina, a historic coastal town, flames spread rapidly through dry grasslands and into the community. High winds pushed embers far ahead of the fire front, igniting structures faster than response efforts could adapt. Residents later described losing power and communications early in the event. With sirens silent and limited warning, many were forced to make split-second decisions. Some fled through smoke-filled streets. Others sought refuge along the shoreline or entered the ocean to escape the heat as fire moved through the town. Much of Lahaina's historic district was destroyed, including cultural landmarks and homes that had stood for generations. The loss of life was significant, making it one of the deadliest fires in modern U.S. history. The Lahaina fire exposed vulnerabilities unique to island communities, including limited evacuation routes, dependence on centralized infrastructure, and challenges in emergency communication during extreme weather. It also raised broader questions about land management, climate conditions, and preparedness in high-wind environments. Lahaina's loss was not just structural. It was cultural and generational. The fire served as a reminder that disasters can erase history as well as homes, and that resilience must account for more than buildings alone. Tubbs Fire, 2017. In October of 2017, Northern California was facing extreme wildfire conditions. Prolonged drought, dry vegetation, and strong offshore winds had created a highly volatile landscape. Many communities in the region were built along the edges of wildland areas, often without anticipating how quickly fire could move into developed neighborhoods. The Tubbs Fire ignited on the night of October 8th in Napa County. Driven by powerful winds, it spread rapidly downhill and toward populated areas while most residents were asleep. Unlike traditional wildfires that advance through forests, the Tubbs Fire transitioned into a structure-to-structure fire once it reached suburban neighborhoods. Survivors described waking to glowing skies and embers raining down. Fire jumped roads, bypassed natural barriers, and ignited homes blocks ahead of the main fire front. Evacuations were chaotic, with limited warning and widespread confusion as flames entered Santa Rosa within hours. By the time the fire was contained, 22 people had been killed, and more than 5,600 structures were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out overnight. The Tubbs Fire became one of the most destructive fires in California history at the time. The fire challenged long-standing assumptions about wildfire behavior. It demonstrated that modern wildfires could behave like urban fires, spreading rapidly through residential areas regardless of traditional fire breaks. In response, evacuation protocols, fire modeling, and land use planning were reevaluated across the state. The Tubbs Fire reinforced a critical lesson. When fire enters developed areas, the distinction between wildfire and city fire disappears, and preparedness must reflect that reality. Woolsey Fire, 2018. In November of 2018, Southern California was experiencing classic late-season wildfire conditions. Prolonged drought had left vegetation critically dry, and powerful Santa Ana winds were forecast to intensify across the region. Communities stretched from inland canyons to the coast, many built directly within fire-prone terrain. On November 8th, the Woolsey Fire ignited in Ventura County. Driven by extreme winds, the fire spread rapidly through steep canyons and across ridgelines, overwhelming early suppression efforts. Flames moved faster than containment lines could be established, crossing highways and advancing toward densely populated neighborhoods. Residents later described ash falling like snow and skies turning orange in the middle of the day. Evacuations expanded quickly, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. The fire ultimately pushed all the way to the Pacific Ocean, an uncommon but telling demonstration of its intensity and speed. By the time the Woolsey Fire was contained, it had destroyed more than 1,600 structures and burned nearly 100,000 acres. 3 people were killed, and entire communities were displaced. The fire also burned through protected lands and iconic landscapes, underscoring the reach of modern wildfires. The Woolsey Fire reinforced the reality that wind-driven fires in Southern California can overwhelm even well-resourced response systems. It emphasized the need for defensible space, hardened structures, and early evacuation decisions. More broadly, Woolsey demonstrated how geography, weather, and development intersect. When fire moves through canyons under extreme wind, response options shrink rapidly. Preparedness becomes less about reaction and more about choices made long before fire season begins. Dixie Fire, Greenville, 2021. In the summer of 2021, Northern California was experiencing one of the most severe fire seasons on record. Years of drought, high temperatures, and dense forest fuels had created conditions ripe for large, long-duration wildfires. Small mountain communities were particularly vulnerable, surrounded by forests with limited evacuation routes. The Dixie Fire ignited in July 2021 and burned for months across multiple counties. As it expanded, it became one of the largest wildfires in California history. In August, the fire reached the town of Greenville, a small mountain community nestled in a forested valley. Residents were ordered to evacuate, but the speed and intensity of the fire left little time. Winds pushed flames directly into the town. Fire moved from tree to structure and back again, igniting buildings almost simultaneously. Within hours, most of Greenville was destroyed. Eyewitnesses later described returning to streets that no longer existed. Familiar landmarks, homes, and businesses were reduced to ash. Nearly the entire downtown area was lost, including historic buildings that defined the community's identity. Although no lives were lost in Greenville itself, the destruction was nearly total. Across the broader Dixie Fire, thousands of structures were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of acres burned. The loss of Greenville highlighted the extreme vulnerability of small mountain towns surrounded by dense forests. It also demonstrated how modern megafires can overwhelm traditional firefighting strategies through sheer size and duration. The Dixie Fire reinforced a sobering reality. Some fires are no longer single events. They are seasons-long disasters, reshaping landscapes and communities long after the flames are gone. Marshall Fire, 2021. In December of 2021, few people considered suburban Colorado a high wildfire risk in the middle of winter. Yet a combination of drought, unseasonably warm temperatures, and extreme winds created the conditions for disaster along the Front Range. On December 30th, the Marshall Fire ignited in Boulder County, driven by wind gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour. What began as a grass fire spread with extraordinary speed. Within hours, flames tore through open fields and directly into suburban neighborhoods. Residents later described seeing fire outrun emergency vehicles. Entire blocks ignited almost simultaneously as embers carried by the wind landed on homes, fences, and decks. Evacuation orders struggled to keep pace with the fire's movement, forcing many residents to flee with little warning. By the time the fire was contained, over 1,000 homes and buildings had been destroyed, making it the most destructive wildfire in Colorado's history. 2 people were killed, and tens of thousands were displaced in a matter of hours. The Marshall Fire shattered long-held assumptions about wildfire geography and seasonality. It proved that wildfire is not limited to forests, mountains, or summer months. Under the right conditions, grass fires can become urban disasters almost instantly. In response, land use planning, building codes, and emergency management strategies across the region were re-examined. The fire reinforced a critical lesson: preparedness must be based on conditions, not expectations. Cedar Fire, 2003. In the fall of 2003, Southern California was experiencing severe drought conditions. Vegetation across the region was dry and highly combustible. At the same time, strong Santa Ana winds were developing, creating an environment where any ignition could escalate rapidly. On October 25, 2003, the Cedar Fire ignited in eastern San Diego County after a lost hunter started a signal fire. Almost immediately, shifting winds drove the flames into surrounding chaparral-covered hills. Once the Santa Ana winds intensified, the fire exploded in size and speed. The fire moved rapidly through rugged terrain, pushing toward populated areas. Embers carried by the wind ignited new fires miles ahead of the main front. Residents later described flames cresting hillsides and racing through canyons with little warning. Evacuations were widespread and often conducted under extreme pressure. By the time the Cedar Fire was contained, it had burned more than 270,000 acres and destroyed over 2,800 structures. 15 people were killed, including one firefighter. Entire neighborhoods were lost, and tens of thousands of residents were displaced. The Cedar Fire became a defining moment in California wildfire history. It highlighted the destructive potential of wind-driven fires in chaparral ecosystems and exposed limitations in suppression-focused strategies. In its aftermath, Southern California reevaluated evacuation protocols, defensible space requirements, and interagency coordination. The Cedar Fire reinforced a recurring lesson throughout this series. When weather, fuel, and terrain align, fire behavior overwhelms response. Preparedness must begin long before ignition. Across centuries, across cities, and across landscapes, these fires all tell the same story. The causes differ. The conditions change. But the outcome is always shaped long before the first flame appears. Disaster is rarely the result of a single failure. It is the result of systems stretched thin, warnings ignored, and risks normalized over time.